Assalamu alaikum, Ali and Hasnain. Great to see you guys again. So happy to have you on this episode. Today we are discussing where is positive Muslim representation in Hollywood. And I think if you guys are anything like me in that I grew up watching all sorts of films and not seeing anyone who looked like me or believed what I did in those films, I'm sure you guys can share that kind of sentiment growing up. So like Hasnain, tell us like your experience growing up. And you know, being someone who enjoys watching film, who enjoys watching TV, who enjoys storytelling, how did you feel not seeing proper Muslim representation in those films?
Yeah, walaikum assalam. So growing up, it was difficult because I didn't really understand the whole fact of like misrepresentation of Muslims in the film industry. Because growing up, it was like Titanic, it was like The Goonies, you know, it was like those classic films that would just be repeated. Catch Me If You Can, all time classic. So growing up, I didn't understand the whole misrepresentation of Muslims or of anybody in film until I hit high school. I think that's kind of where it was, where I started seeing Muslims being portrayed, or especially Arabs, because at that time it was mostly like the Arab kind of identity being kind of taken into consideration as like these are different people, these are others, these are like the bad guys. And so for me, it was a life-changing experience after high school when I understood like what films meant, because growing up, you were watching just comedy and just like films that didn't really mean much to you until like you started watching like The Message, and you started watching like all these other films that gave you some sort of like knowledge, and then you start questioning it. So for somebody who loves films, I love the classics. But growing up after high school into college when I started taking a lot of drama classes for myself, I was pursuing acting. Junior year of college and moving forward, that's kind of where you started seeing the implementation of Muslims or just people of color into films. But even then, it wasn't lead roles. It was more like the antagonist. It was more of like this white hero is going to go into some random country in the Middle East because there's a bomb threat, there's a virus threat, and we have to kill all these bad guys who just so happen to have turban and a thobe, and okay, they're Arabs. It was more of the learning and the understanding process growing up. And now being, the age that I am, doing as many films as I've done, watching as many as I did, that's kind of why the films that I pursue now, acting, producing, writing, is more of that white role is no longer American. It's the American hero is now a colored individual. So that's kind of my experience.
I think what's so interesting, you talked about how when you grow up, like you don't think about, am I being represented on TV? It's more subconscious. So even like for me, up until very recently, it's so normal to see, an Arab bad guy in a film, or, a lack of Muslims in film. And I think our last guest, Karel, said something very nice. He said, when you're not represented on film, you're almost taught that you're lesser than non-Muslims and non-brown people, essentially. And I think it's also a sort of acceptance. Like, it was normal for a long time to not see a Muslim on TV or on a film. It's normal, I remember Rizam had said in his speech in Parliament, he was like, whenever we saw a Pakistani on TV, like my mum would shout, that there's an Asian on TV, and I'd come running downstairs to see that person on TV. And even us growing up, like I remember when we saw an Asian on TV, a South Asian on TV, it'd be like a big deal. Like, we're like, wow, this is actually happening. And you have that sense of, you don't feel like you belong in that environment. So you're sitting down at home watching TV, and it's two separate worlds. Our world is one world where we live and exist, and TV and film is another world that we can watch, but we can't belong in it. So Ali, like, what was your experience growing up, in the same kind of light?
Islam. For me, I think what I can remember is back to Indiana Jones days when he would go and on these
1960s, right?
Before you guys came around. And that's what I remember. I guess initially seeing Muslims on TV, and it was a little bit of a mix, I would say. Some bad guys, some good guys that were helping Indiana Jones get
I remember there was, I haven't seen the film, but there was that scene like where there was like an Arab guy who came out with a sword or something, and he just takes out his gun and shoots the guy.
Yeah.
Which is a pretty good, and the thing is, like, when you see it for the first time, it's funny, it's interesting, but like when you sit down and think about it, like sometimes I haven't seen the whole film, so maybe you can tell me if there's any kind of like good Muslim characters or not. But like when I just see that scene, it's like, to me, Arab Muslims are reduced to that, like a funny bad guy who has no lines of dialogue apart from maybe he's just shouting Arabic or something. He looks exotic, and he's taken out by the white American guy in 10 seconds.
I know exactly what scene you're talking about. I thought it was pretty funny. I actually just rewatched it.
Nice.
But in that film, he actually has someone that's Arab, or I think Egyptian, but he's actually helping him, and he's a Muslim guy.
Okay.
He's throughout everything that he's trying to achieve. So that's what I mean. It shows both sides with Indiana Jones way back then.
With the good character, like, is it explicit that he's a Muslim, or?
Yeah.
Like, can you give us examples of what they show?
Here's one thing I did notice. That guy did not have a beard, right? But he was Muslim. But the other guy, the bad guy that's Muslim, has a beard. Yeah. If you think about it, and this is going off topic a little bit, but if you think about it with the cartoons as we're growing up, with all the different types of cartoons we watched, I would say 99% of the time, the bad guy always had a beard. And the good guy was clean shaven. So if you look at how, subconsciously that's like built into our brains ever since we were kids, well, before you guys were born, that kind of continues on. If you look at it right now, just like the guy that we talked about, he has a beard, he has a sword, comes out, he gets shot. He's a bad guy. Yeah. But the good guy, that's also an Arab, is Muslim, but he's clean shaven, so he's a little more modern, I guess, is what.
Even like Back to the Future, which I'm sure you must have seen it in theater when it came out, because you were like, 20 when Back to the Future came out, right? But when in Back to the Future, you have that scene in the beginning, and again, like Back to the Future, we've all seen those films, we all love those films. You think about them, they're kind of films that we revisit. I would say like every year or every few years, and rewatch them. They're so they're a big part of our lives forever, because we're rewatching them all the time, right? And when you see a scene like that in the beginning, for those who haven't seen it, the doctor is like, "Oh, I stole this uranium. I think it's from Arabs or some sort of Arabs," and they come in a car with AK-47s, shouting Arabic and having like scarves wrapped around their heads, and just basically shoot at him and kill him. And it's like when the first time you see that, or at least when we watched it a few years, in the past, let's say, I think there's two eras of Hollywood when it comes to Muslim representation. There's the old era, which we can talk about later, which is kind of spurs out all those obvious tropes of those obvious Islamophobic tropes depicting Arabs as enemies and bad guys and terrorists. And then there's a current era, which I think is a bit more lenient, which we can discuss in detail. But like growing up in that old era of Muslim depiction in Hollywood, you'd watch it and not think twice. Even though when the film finishes, it's Zuhr prayer, for example, you'll get up and do your Zuhr prayer, and you'll be so in touch with your religion and be so desensitized to the fact that your people were mocked so openly in a film that millions and millions of people saw. So Hasnain, why do you think? I guess if we can separate Hollywood into an old era and a current era, let's talk about old era Hollywood. Why do you guys think that the old era of Hollywood was so Islamophobic?
So before I answer that, there's actually a fact that my old drama teacher a few years back told me. She's like, "Hey, you should read into this." And I'm just going to read it real quick because
go ahead.
It kind of leads the way into it. So basically between 1911 and 2017, more than 800 feature films received support from the U.S. government's Department of Defense, the DoD, right? So that it explains the support that was traded between scripts and basically, the Department of Defense. So she was just like, if you want to view Hollywood's whole point of why a lot of these Arabs or these, she said others, are depicted as enemies, because there's been a trade-off, right? The Department of Defense is going to give these writers money, and then in turn, they want to be executive producers on the script, which means they want to say. So, your question was, I'm sorry, I went off on a tangent there, but it was old school versus new. News Corps,
Yeah,
right?
but before you answer that question, is that specific to films that depict military, or just generally any sort of
Just
film?
800 feature films within that era, so big box office budgets, received that money,
Okay.
right?
So basically,
And
so basically, you could say Hollywood is a state-sponsored.
basically, that's what she's
You're cutting out.
Hasnain, sorry, you're cutting up.
but
Hasnain, sorry,
can you hear me now?
Yeah. Can you just what were you saying about your response to Ali's question?
Can you hear me?
Ali's fact. Yeah, we hear you.
All right. So yeah, basically he's right. Like, you know, it's a lot of the top-notch films were receiving money from the Department of Defense, right? So you can see a correlation there on why certain films are depicting Muslims or other groups as like the enemy, right? Because it's a propaganda scheme, right? When there was a Cold War, you know, Russia, you would have like these mad scientists being with the Russian accent, you know, doing that type of thing. So
Yeah.
I just want to lead off with that. And
I think what's interesting is that it shows, you know, something that I feel like we as the Muslim community, or we as Muslims, let's say generally, have really missed, and perhaps other minority communities have missed as well, is that, you know, the Department of Defense, we can sit here and, you know, rip on them all day, but the fact remains that they understand the power of Hollywood and the power of media,
yeah,
and
absolutely.
they dedicated the time and resources to invest in that. And unfortunately, on the flip side, minority communities have not, you know, objectively invested much time at all into trying to get themselves into positions where they can tell their own stories. I think now it's much better than what used to be. And it's interesting because I wrote a whole article about this for the Muslim Vibe, and touched upon a few articles that I read like across the web. And one of them goes back to something that Raza Aslan said. He gave a speech at Ummah a few years ago. I think it was 2015, and I was there. And he was speaking about how Joe Biden, back in those days, he came out and said that he's changed his mind about same-sex marriage. And when people asked him why he changed his mind, he said, "Oh, I changed my mind because of Will and Grace." And everyone laughed at him.
That's a good show, by the way.
But the thing is, everyone laughed at him. But the thing is, he was, you know, the point that Raza Aslan was saying was that he's absolutely correct, because, you know, Will and Grace has changed perceptions about same-sex marriage for Americans across, you know, the country. And he also, you know, stated an interesting fact. I forget the numbers he used exactly, but he was talking about how the most watched news outlet in America is Fox News, right? Hearing that kind of scares you, because you know the kind of rhetoric that Fox News spits out. And the kind of damage they cause. But when you compare the numbers of the amount of people that watch Fox News to the amount of people that saw, let's say, for example, the finale of How I Met Your Mother, the numbers are drastically, you know, different. The numbers are abysmal compared to the amount of Americans that watch, you know, TV and film. And his point was like, that's how you change perceptions in this country. You don't change it, you know, just by trying to get a foothold in the news. You change it by telling real stories that millions of Americans will watch. And, you know, it's funny because I know we're kind of going a bit off topic, but I remember, for example, I don't know if you guys were fans of Lost back in 2004 when that show first started, but amongst the different characters that came out, there was, they decided to include one character, Saeed Jarrah. So basically the whole story of Lost is that there's a plane crash and there's certain survivors that land on this mysterious island. One of them was an Iraqi Muslim. Right. And at that time, even though, you know, he wasn't played by a Muslim, at that time, having someone of that character on TV, for me, was like, oh, wow, this is a hit TV show that millions and millions of people are watching. And they chose to have one of the main characters that everyone still loves till today, be an Iraqi, Arab, Muslim. And, you know, you see him even praying in the show. And I think that influence, we can't deny the kind of impact and influence that has on the modern day, on the general public, especially when they don't see Muslims around them, they don't interact with Muslims. So the only depiction they have of Muslims is on TV. And I think if you show them Muslims in their element as normal people, that's how you create tolerance between different peoples. So Hasnain, going back to the topic, why is Hollywood so Islamophobic?
I think it comes down to a little bit of what I said, where the money comes from and the control. And a little bit of what you said in regards to the depiction of what's to come, right? One thing that I've learned is that in like directors and writers, when they hire actors, they rather have somebody who has like a real world experience, who's been there, done that, rather than an actor who's never been behind a desk and then plays a role of him sitting behind a desk. Because now he's like watching other people like act behind the desk, he's like imagining it, but it's not the same as an individual who's sitting behind a desk. So I think there's Islamophobia in Hollywood, one because of control and basically lack of knowledge, right? Lack of knowledge of who we really are, what we really represent, how our day-to-day lives is exactly the same. I put on a suit and tie when I go to my 9 to 5 job, just like any other individual male that would go to that same job, right? I put on the same actor's hat and memorize my script when I go for auditions. I use this, I do the same thing. I'm just as a New Yorker as anybody else. But the thing is, because that depiction of how Hollywood portrays us and basically the events that happen in the world, and they write stuff like that, and then they use that real life, like what happened, to use that as a script and go based off of just that simple knowledge, without actually understanding what's going on. I think that's kind of why Hollywood is Islamophobic. And it just hasn't changed since, when the Department of Defense keeps pumping out money and the depiction of the individuals are still the same. We've been stuck in that era. And it's individuals like myself and even like people who are more established to kind of try to change that over time. So I think that's kind of the 2 cents. It's just a lack of knowledge and the amount of money being thrown at these big time writers.
Ali, you've been in a film that kind of depicts let's say Muslims doing somewhat extremist acts. I don't mean to call you out on it, but I genuinely actually want to have this conversation. We won't say the name of the film and we won't say what your role was, but just like genuinely speaking, like being on set and like kind of like dealing with the audition process and the directors and the writers. Did you feel like the people that you were dealing with, or just the industry in general, let's say, do you feel like they had much knowledge of what they were discussing? Was it more like entertainment for them? Did you feel like they understood what they were discussing, what they were depicting?
I think for them, it's more so about just getting the job done. It's not so much the emotional or the intellectual end of it. It's just saying that, okay, this is a script, ABC, this is what you have to do. That's it. Do your role.
So you weren't in touch with anyone who was like in the creative process, like the director or the screenwriter? Did you have any contact with them, or?
I did speak with Ridley Scott, and he was just like, "Hey, you're doing a great job." Just like nothing really like more than just say, "Great job, let's do the scene again, do it this way," and so forth. Just direction. Okay. And then even at one point, he asked me to just come up with the lines. He's like, "Hey, come up with the lines, say something in Arabic or Nouri, whatever." I think I ended up doing Urdu. And
I actually watched it today, and it's funny because I've never actually seen it, and I was watching it, I was thinking that shot is really good, the way it's like pointed up at you and the lighting. I thought it was beautiful. So well done, you did a great job.
It was so hot in there, I was burning up, and like between the I was drinking water, and then I had to go to the bathroom.
Oh my god, wow.
Stop everything, I have to go. But he just asked me to say something in Arabic or in Urdu. So I came up with a line and I told him what it means. He's like, "All right, great, let's do it." And then we just ran with it. So
what surah did you pick?
The thing is, like, it's funny because with Homeland, for example, Homeland, as you know, is a really like Islamophobic show. I don't need to talk about it and go into it. But there was a story that kind of went viral a few years ago because they hired these Arabic graffiti artists to like spray paint graffiti in Arabic on the wall so they can use it in the set in the war-torn country that they were representing. And what these guys done was they started spray painting things like "Homeland is racist" and "Don't watch the show" in Arabic. And what they said afterwards was that they were amazed with how the producers of the show didn't care what they were spray painting. They didn't care what it said. They just wanted to see Arabic letters on the wall. Yeah. So like in that sense, I feel like that there's a great sense of people in Hollywood who are telling stories that they are telling stories that they don't have full knowledge of. They don't have full knowledge of Muslim communities, what it means to be Muslim, the Muslim experience, and they're telling these stories. Now with Ridley Scott specifically, I can't be too harsh on him because he also made Kingdom of Heaven, which, you know, in that film, if you guys have seen it, you know, he shows the Muslims to be, if anything, far superior in their character and their mannerisms and their justice to the Christians at the time, you know, which I think was very interesting. So, like, based on that, what's the best Muslim stories that you guys have seen in Hollywood? Because I know we can speak all day about how bad Hollywood is and you know the kind of horrible depictions that it has shown. But I think there are a few here and there films that we can like pick up on and just kind of pick apart a bit and look at the Muslim representation that they feature and ask ourselves, you know, is it actually positive, or how would we prefer to like have it changed per se? Hasnain, what would you say?
Kingdom of Heaven is definitely a good one. Definitely a good one. But I'll let you talk about that because you mentioned it first. I will. So I'll name a few that come to my mind. Ali, the movie about Muhammad Ali the boxer. I think that was phenomenal.
For sure. I was gonna mention that as well.
Yeah. I am currently watching Malcolm X.
Nice.
You know, the whole him
4 hours and a half or something. It's very long.
No, I'm watching the one with Denzel Washington. It's like 2.5.
Oh, was it 2.5? I thought it was like 3 hours. Something. Okay.
It's a really good story, and it shows his you know, trials and tribulations before and after being Muslim. Very great. But I would also say there's some fragments of specific movies where
Hasnain, sorry,
where it showcases not Muslims in a positive light. Again?
Yeah, your internet is really, you got to really upgrade your internet.
Oh, no, am I good?
What's going on?
Yo, listen, okay, it's hard out here.
Hard times.
Hard times, man. So I'll keep it short. So The Reluctant Fundamentalist, however, it wasn't putting Muslims in a positive light, but it showed the main character, who was Muslim, successful. Like Riz Ahmed was playing I think he was either like a marketing executive or a broker, but he was shown as a successful business individual moving up the ladder. And that's also positive representation, because I'm done with seeing Muslims, you know, having the jobs that are stereotypical as well. So I'll just mention that little segment in that film as well.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned, you know, Riz Ahmed, and we spoke before about how we're big fans of The Night Of, which I think was just, I think that's probably the first example I can remember of like a really big Hollywood production that was also something that so many people watched, that didn't just have a Muslim character. It wasn't just the fact that he was Muslim. It was the fact that it really went deep into, you know, how his Muslimness affected the events around him. You know, the fact that the whole idea of the series was this guy. It's not just a kid from a school that is in a sticky situation and thrown in prison. Rather, it's a Pakistani Muslim American from Queens, New York, and you have all those kind of factors that really featured into it. And I remember, you know, there's so many interesting tidbits where I was sitting down like, wow. And I'm sure, Hasnain, you remember there was a part where he's like, where the news forecast was saying something like about how the mosque Khoi in Queens got attacked. I remember it was episode 3 or 4 or something, and it starts off with that kind of news excerpt. And like, I was like, wow. And I sat back and, I've just heard, you know, a mosque that we've all visited be featured in a TV series. And, you know, you see him, you know, praying, you see him being religious, you see how his Muslimness kind of affects the story. And I think personally, like, that's just so refreshing to see, because it's something we never ever get to see. Ali, what were your like thoughts when you first saw that series?
Yeah, I think that was amazing. Just to be able to, like you mentioned, be able to see him praying and just go through normal life. And that's not something we're accustomed to. So I would agree with what you're saying. I don't have much else to add on to
it. Have you seen the movie? Have you seen the movie Ali's Wedding?
I have, yeah, I've seen
on
it.
Netflix.
That's really
it's a quirky comedy. Not my cup of tea, but I think that was also a really good film in regards to
Ali's Wedding. So that was really cool for us because, you know, the fact that we're Shia Muslims, and like the first time seeing like a Shia mosque like depicted so heavily in a film was so interesting. I think what's interesting about that was that it was his own story, his own personal story that kind of happened to him. And that's what made it kind of so interesting. The fact that he was telling his own story and telling it in such a weird and funny way. But again, just like seeing a Shia mosque, seeing, you know, his dad with the turban on, you know, seeing the fact that there's an argument between the Sayyid of the mosque and the Sheikh of the mosque, like just seeing all that, it's so refreshing because you don't see that depicted. You don't see these communities depicted in a positive manner in film and TV. And I think that really has a negative effect when it comes to perceptions of Muslims and of course ourselves as well, because like I said, like when you don't see yourself in TV and film, you don't believe in yourself sometimes. You know, you don't feel that you are capable of not just getting into film and TV, but doing things sometimes that are great. You know, if all, you know, for example, successful entrepreneurs in the world were white Americans, you know, every Pakistani in America, you know, when they're growing up, they won't feel like they belong in that environment. And I think that it's so important to have that, you know, that kind of to be taught that you are capable of success and capable of greatness.
Ali's Wedding is a quirky show. You also have, you know, Kumail Nanjiani in The Big Sick. I mean,
we need to talk about that. We need to talk about that. We will.
I thought we're continuing the conversation right now.
No, we are, but now saying we need to talk about that specifically, The Big Sick and Kumail Nanjiani. I think it's an important conversation to have. Yeah,
100%. So I think that's also. I don't know if it is a positive to me. Him playing who he was in that film, to me, is a positive thing because there was no religious bias. You can tell by a brown man being behind an Uber driver doing his thing is enough for a lead role in the comedy, which was successful, right? So I think that's it. But then, you know, again, you mentioned we can go off and talk about all the bad films and the misrepresentation there. But I think, you know, moving into the next segment is like, you know, what is needed currently to you know, progress the Muslim representation, right? You know, what is needed.
So before we get into that, and this kind of ties into the topic as well, the title of this conversation is "Where is Positive Muslim Representation?" And what I kind of meant by putting this conversation under that theme was not just, oh, you know, we want to see Muslims having fun and being normal people. Because so many Muslims are terrorists on TV and film, but also films like The Big Sick, for example. You know, and I think there's a lot of examples of, you have Master of None as well, which has an episode. I haven't seen it fully, but it has an episode which is kind of similar, where you have Aziz Ansari like tackling his relationship with his faith and his identity and stuff like that. And I feel like there's an issue of lack of the Muslim representation, but Muslims who are, let's say, how do I say this? Muslims who really live by their faith. I feel like many Muslim characters who I've seen on TV and film, in films, for example, like The Big Sick, like Kumail is constantly battling with his religious belief, not just his culture, but his actual belief. He's combating with the idea of praying. He's combating with the idea of you know, being a Muslim. It's not just about his culture. And I feel like the issue there is that what happens is you paint a story that all Muslims who are on TV and film have this issue where they're struggling with their faith. And reconciling their identity with their faith. Even for the film, for example, Apple TV done a film recently, Hala. I haven't seen all of it. I don't.
I saw the whole thing.
You saw the whole thing.
I saw the whole, because of you. I saw the whole thing.
I've only seen half of it. I stopped watching it. But even that, it's like because I haven't seen the whole thing. Maybe I can't properly commentate. I wouldn't recommend everyone kind of goes out and see it, because it has some like scenes that are quite inappropriate. But it's like you'll never see an empowered Muslim character. She's oppressed by. You know, I get it. I get the idea that, you know, she's a youth and she's struggling with her identity. Fine, that makes sense. But at the same time, it's almost like, you know, you're never seen a Muslim woman on film that takes ownership of her identity, of her faith. It's so it's almost like a weapon. You know, she's so proud of it, and she indulges it. And the challenges that she faces in the story or the film aren't to do with her faith. Rather, her faith helps her through those challenges. And I'm not saying we need to make a film where Muslims are absolutely perfect and they don't do anything wrong, because films are centered on the idea that characters have flaws, they have issues, they have struggles, right? But my issue is that the struggle is always to do with their faith. And frankly, like between, you know, the people that we know, and generally with Muslims, I don't feel like there is for how do I say this? I think it's important to also depict Muslims who are comfortable with their faith. We all struggle with our faith.
Yeah.
But the problem is that so many Muslim characters on film and TV aren't comfortable with their faith, and that's what kind of upsets me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
That's my.
Yeah, I agree. Especially when we're talking about the Big Sick, and even other ones like Remy and other things that are on TV. A lot of times, that's all it's doing is like, hey, am I supposed to be doing this? Am I not supposed to be doing this? With Remy, first season when he goes over to Egypt and he's learning about the different parts of Egypt and religion and so on. But he leaves here and he's so undecided and so just like kind of fighting within himself. Yeah. And that's good to show because it's good, it's natural, it's what we go through. But we also, like you said, need to have someone that actually is like strong in their faith and just living life according to that and going and doing different activities, within that frame.
Yeah. So let me ask you this then, because this is also an interesting conversation to have. When it comes to Kumail Nanjiani's The Big Sick and Rami's Rami, like I have a lot of issues with Rami as well, which maybe we can get into. But
we'll just invite him and let him talk about it.
Hopefully. But the thing is, like when it comes to these stories, I understand that The Big Sick is not my story. It's Kumail's story. I understand that Rami is not my story. It's Rami's story. Fine. Right. But there's a question. If you're depicting the Muslim experience on a platform where there is almost no examples of Muslim experience being shown properly, do you have a responsibility, a greater responsibility, to be cautious in what you show? Did, for example, The Big Sick, there's this line that he says, and I can't get it out of my head. Toward the end, he's I think fighting with his wife, his girlfriend, sorry, and he says, "I'm fighting a 14,000-year-old culture." He's not saying I'm fighting my Pakistani roots. I'm not fighting, what it's like to be a Pakistani living in Chicago. I'm not fighting diaspora. What I'm fighting is a 14,000. He says culture, but like to me, that sounds like I'm fighting Islamic values almost in many ways. And it's like, if you're going to include that, fine. But why not kind of show the other side? And again, like Kumail, like I'm not here to judge his religiousness or his relationship with his faith. But the same way shows like, every other show has a responsibility to include, let's say, for example, a diverse cast. They have a responsibility to make sure that there's African Americans who are in the show that aren't, for example, robbers or whatever, or thieves or gang members. The same way you have that, surely, Kumail has a responsibility to include a character in the show, or at least an idea in the show that shows that there are Muslims who enjoy their faith and have their own issues that aren't related to believing in God. Because we all have struggles when it comes to being Muslim. We all have struggles even with our faith. But I feel like all these things are, tackling the struggle of actually believing in God, Muhammad, and the Quran. And I feel like when it comes to Muslims generally, on a general sense, many Muslims, at least, from what I understand, I'm sure you guys will agree, we have our struggles, but we don't, necessarily doubt the kind of like the foundations of our belief. And I understand that there are Muslims out there that do. That's fine. But the issue is when it comes to representation on film, there is no kind of balance to those two kind of sides of the conversation. And I think that is really what kind of upsets me. Even, for example, with Homeland. I know Homeland is a very, very Islamophobic show. But for those who haven't seen it, Homeland is about a soldier who comes back from the dead, and that they thought he was dead, but it turns out he was captured, and he was rescued by the American army. He comes back home, and secretly he's actually a Muslim. So the whole show is about, is he a terrorist or is he not, right? And in the end of, I think, episode 1 or episode 2, it shows him putting down his prayer mat and praying. So we realize as an audience that he's actually a Muslim. And what happens in the next episode, his wife comes to him. She goes, when she finds out, or whenever she finds out that he's a Muslim, she says, "Why did you convert? What's happening with you?" She asked him these questions. And my issue is not that those questions were asked. My issue is not that there is a debate as to whether or not he's a terrorist even because he's a Muslim. My issue is that when she asked him these questions, he doesn't answer. He doesn't know what to say. And that's my issue. If you're going to go out of your way to show that Muslims might be terrorists, why not go out of your way to show that Muslims aren't terrorists? Yeah. You know what I mean? And that's my biggest issue.
Yeah. All right. So, to answer question number 1, Individuals who are telling their story in Hollywood, who have the big budget, like Rami, Kumail, and Riz, and whoever else. Yeah, they do have a responsibility. I personally think so as well. I think that if I was in their place, I would have a responsibility. I want to tell my story because that's where the script and that's where the story comes from. That's where the uniqueness of the story you're telling comes from. Yeah. But I feel like I have a responsibility to not just Muslims, but to the whole world, to educate people who aren't educated, to show the light, for example, like to show that, hey, I'm just as normal as anybody else. Yeah. I practice what I practice differently, and you practice what you practice differently, but we both like a New York sliced pizza. We both like the same thing. So yeah, I think they do have a responsibility. But again, I knowing how much it takes to write something and to get it out there, I know how much push and pull it is. Yeah. But I won't get into that. But I do think that there's a responsibility there. In regards to why not show it? Why not show the opposite end? I completely agree, and that's kind of what I do with my films. That's kind of what I'm trying to push. But again, in the indie world, you're going up against your competition is a lot heavier. Yeah. But that's what I've been trying to do. That's why I scrapped a lot of my films. I was writing a love story about a Muslim Pakistani like myself who's strong in his faith, and the issue is this girl enters his life, right? This girl enters his life, and to me it was just like, damn, no, I'm scratching it all. And then I moved on to another film that actually, and I want to mention this because I think it's beautiful. My acting coach, who's a white woman, not Muslim at all, wrote a short film showing a Muslim gas attendant. Alvi, you've probably seen my short film.
Yeah, I think I saw bits of it.
Yeah,
I watched the whole thing, I promise.
Yeah, showing a gas attendant who I play, and the audience is be like, oh my God, like this domestically abused woman is coming into this gas station. What's going to happen? And he writes the film where I actually help her because I'm just a good human being. Yeah, you're judging me based on the way I look. But at the end of the day, I help her by filling gas in her car, helping her with some money because she looks like she needs the help. But that was written not by me, by my acting coach. Yeah. Because she saw it as well. So I feel like we're going in the right direction, but it needs to be from the top. It can't be in short 10-minute indie filmmaker Hasnain and Ali writing this.
I don't know. I mean, I think the onus is on people to. I feel like the stories that are real, the stories that are different and unique, are the ones that will stand out. So perhaps like it is incumbent on people on people like you to make these stories to ascend. And kind of like be able to tell those stories on a larger scale. And I think one thing I want to clarify, I feel like the opposite end of all this are Muslim filmmakers who tell really cheesy, positive Muslim stories with like nasheed in the background and stuff like that. I'm not advocating that either, because a story has to have problems. A story has to have problems for the characters to overcome. They have to be flawed. Characters have to be flawed in stories. You can't have a perfect Muslim who's perfect. He prays on time. He's nice to his wife. He's nice to his mom. He comes in on time at work. He leaves it, because then that's not a film. What are you watching? You know what I mean? So we have to have flawed characters. We have to have characters with issues. My thing is, the issue shouldn't be, it would be nice to see at least Muslim characters who their problem isn't their faith. Their problem is, let's say, for example, they're in a war with someone, or for example, they're in a fight with someone, or for example, they're in a thriller or whatever. Just like any other character, when you get a white person, for example, a white American, and you make a film about, just pick any film out of your head and think about the storyline. The story isn't like, oh, James Bond, for example, is off to fight the enemy, but at the same time he's struggling with his white identity, and he's struggling with being a British person when he's out in Spain. That's not what the story is. And I think that's what's kind of upsetting. I just want to see Muslims who are normal. And again, like I mentioned in the beginning, Lost, Saeed, there was one kind of like episode which is a bit dodgy, but generally speaking, his Muslimness isn't what defines him. He's seen praying now and then, but he's flawed as an individual. Yeah. He's not flawed because of his faith. He's just flawed, and I think that's really good to see. So, Ali, you tell me, what do you think defines positive Muslim representation?
I think we have a little ways to go to where you want to see it, and where we would want to see it. And I think it'll get there. It just takes some time, because initially, if you look at historically, it's been Muslim equal terrorist, Muslim equal terrorist, and now you have the likes of Remy and some of the other ones that are coming out where it's more maybe a little too left leaning from what you're looking for, right?
To say the least.
So maybe, I don't know, Hasnain writes something where it's a little more centered or towards.
I hate writing. You write it.
Nouri, you write it.
Nouri, you write it.
I've been talking about writing a film for the past 10 years, and I've realized I'm never going to do it because I just
the first time I met Nouri, I'm writing a film.
I've been writing that film since like 2010, and it's I'm still on page 5. So
we need someone like you, and I think there's someone like you,
or even not me, but maybe like the 9 people that I listen to this podcast. Maybe one of them will get up and make a film.
Out of those 9 people, 4 are me checking to see my camera quality. You mean the 5 people that watch this?
Yeah, for sure.
It was 9 people. It was 9 views. So
9 views. To be fair, we got like 60 views on the video last time I checked. So I guess we're slowly but surely we're getting there.
Inshallah. But yeah, I think this is something that's not necessarily going to come out of Hollywood right away. It's something that maybe Muslims have to fund. And that will happen only when the adults realize, meaning the parents of the kids that are telling them to go to school and become a doctor or a lawyer, or go into finance like Hasnain.
Why are you calling me out?
And they start recognizing that, okay, you know what? Art is important, right? So film is important.
So
and then
is that because I haven't like kind of heard this conversation in quite a while, a few years, but I remember, when we were growing up, there was always that standard conversation, when you have a sheikh coming in and giving you that standard lecture that, our parents are telling all our kids to become doctors and accountants when they should be exploring other avenues. Is that still an issue, do you think, in our communities? Because I think we've been here for a while, we've been in the West for a while now, especially in America. I think what's interesting about America and the UK, the demographics are very different, because depending on kind of like the ethnicity you're talking about, Americans, I feel like, are more in touch generally with their Western culture than British people are, because I feel like when it comes to diaspora in the UK, we kind of like are physically in the UK, but mentally we're still back in, in the East, in Pakistan or the Middle East or wherever we're from. So in America, like, is it still an issue where you have rebelling youth who want to get into films and TV and art and become photographers, but their parents are giving them slack? What's the story?
Of course.
I don't know. I have a different experience than Ali on that.
Ali, generally speaking, what was your experience? Because you got into acting and you've been into what's interesting is you've been into acting for a long time before, it was kind of like cool for a Muslim in the West to get into acting. What was your experience getting into acting in those days? Because I think, not when I say those days, I don't mean like it was like 20, 30 years ago. It wasn't that long ago. But like just generally, like when it came to, telling your parents that you wanted to be in films and, going to auditions, was there any like backlash from community, from family?
I didn't really talk community much, but I know from family, my dad was like, hey, have you read the Quran yet? Instead of reading script, right? So it's like, why don't you focus?
He did have a point. I'm not going to argue with him on that.
See, that's why you need to write the film, see? So it was more so, hey, you need other things that you need to take care of before you can go into something like this.
Yeah.
And leave it, it's not for us, so on and so forth, right? Plus, the scene that we talked about earlier was like, what were you thinking? And I'm like, well, if I didn't do it, somebody else was going to do it anyway.
Yeah. What were you thinking?
He was thinking about the residual check. That's what he was thinking about.
It's funny because, we do give, like, not Ali, but generally actors slack who kind of play terrorists on film. But, sometimes you do need someone to play that role. I don't think the issue is whether or not there is someone playing that role, because in the film, can we say the film, Ali? I don't know. Are we allowed to talk about So the film is Body of Lies. You can check it out. It's probably on Netflix. Ali's scene is right in the beginning. in the first minute or so. But I think in that film specifically, yes, there were terrorists, there were Muslim bad guys, but there were also Muslims who were good guys in that film. And I think, I do still have issues with the way that film kind of depicted Muslim characters generally, but it wasn't like a full-on Islamophobic trope. So you do need people to play those characters ultimately. I think the issue is more so with actors and films that continuously just non-stop show horrible Muslim characters and show them as terrorists. And then you have films like, even recently, I think what's good is, and just kind of like wind up the conversation, I think what's really nice now is we've reached a point, I talked about this old era of Hollywood and this current era. Now I feel like Hollywood realizes that minority stories sell. Black Panther, for example, sells. There was that film, I completely forgot it. It was about Asian Americans. It had a full Asian American cast and it did really well. I think it was last year. Hasnain, do you remember what I'm talking about? I didn't actually watch it, but it was
like a wedding film.
Yeah, I think it was that one.
Crazy Rich Asians, or
say that again, sorry.
Crazy Rich Asians?
Yeah,
Crazy Rich Asians, for example. That was a full-on Asian cast, and they realized that sell. Parasite became an Oscar winner last year, and I think people are realizing that these stories do sell now. So we're entering an era now where we do have Muslim representation. We have Rami, we have The Big Sick, we have so many films where there are Muslims involved. Even Spider-Man. I remember the recent Spider-Man film. You have on his school trip that he went to Europe or wherever he went, you have a hijabi character there as well. So you have Muslims who are being depicted now. And I think the conversation has shifted to where is Muslim representation to where is positive Muslim representation. I think, like you guys said, we're getting there. But the point I was trying to make was, there was a film that came out a few years ago, I'm not sure if you guys saw it, with Mark Wahlberg, Patriots Day, which was about the Boston bombings. And it was basically about the Boston police chasing after these two terrorist kids after the bombings took place. And again, fine, it's depicting a very, hard topic, and it's depicting a very sensitive topic. But in that film, there's a scene, I'll never forget it, where they get the wife of the mayor of, there's two brothers who did the Boston bombing attacks. They get the wife of the older brother and they sit her down, they interrogate her. And she's wearing a full hijab, she looks like perfectly Muslim, practicing Muslim. An officer comes in who's with the CIA or with the interrogation force. She's wearing a hijab as well. And she sits down with her, with this woman. And she tells her, why are you doing this? Why don't you help us find him? And the terrorist wife sits there and says, a Muslim woman's duty is to defend her husband. A Muslim woman's duty is to do this and that. Fine, you tell that story. But then the Muslim officer who's interrogating her doesn't say anything. She doesn't tell her, oh, no, in Islam, actually, it says this, right? What's even worse is that she walks out of the room and takes off her hijab, showing that she wasn't actually a Muslim at all. She was actually a non-Muslim. So it's like a film like that, that's so obviously Islamophobic. I think what's good is it stands out now, because when you watch it, you think, okay, this shouldn't be there. This isn't right. But at the same time, you also have films like American Sniper, which, show Muslims as target practice. Which one did it win an Oscar? I forget if it won an Oscar or not. But it was the best. It was the most grossing film of that year. It was the most grossing film of that year. So more Americans went to see that film than any other film that year, which is pretty crazy. What do you think of it? Generally.
What I'm saying is, I went to see it. I thought, okay, so I thought it was pretty good.
Well, let's admit, production-wise, it was a pretty good film.
No, it was production-wise, story-wise, it was a great film. I think most of it was fake and false, but as a film, it was a good film. But
it was a good film, but obviously, it's not reality.
Yeah. There's a lot of issues in the way it depicts them. I guess it shows that. But again, it did come out and it faced a lot of backlash. There were articles written about it. People spoke about how bad it was. I think if that film came out 10, 20 years ago, no one would bat an eyelid. Everyone would think it's fine, And I think I think it's good that we're heading in that direction. So to kind of close off, Hasnain, what do you think depicts positive Muslim representation?
Hard question, to be honest with you. What depicts positive Muslim representation is just positive Muslim stories that don't it's less about the struggle of the faith, because we're all past that. It's less about, oh my God, this Muslim woman is struggling with her hijab. You know, we didn't even get into that, but you know what I'm talking about with that.
Yeah.
I think the positive Muslim representation is just a normal individual who it's, you know, he's to his faith, but he has other issues. You know, he has other issues. I'm not writing a story about, you know, a individual who's struggling with his faith anymore, because I think we're past that. We're past that. You know, a person can pray 5 times, they read the Quran, but he has a bunch of other issues. Is he going to land a job? You know, he's out of a job. Those are real life issues that are interesting, right? Yeah. Is he going to save the world? Is he, you know, is he an underground computer hacker that just happens to be religious? I don't know. Like, you know, that's like, you know, I want to see. I personally want to see Muslim people play cool roles. Like, I would love a Muslim 008. Yeah. You know, it doesn't have to be 007. You just change the number, 008. You know, I would love to see a Mission Impossible, but the individual is, you know, an Arab or Indian Muslim or whatever. You know, I would love to see, you know, like, you know, films like that where, you know, you see like a lot of cultural, you know, identities coming in. So I think positive Muslim representation starts with the script of writing Muslim individuals as just normal people. I think that's kind of where it starts. You know, there's no backstory to the individual. Individual just has had a grow up a certain way, immigrant family, fine, you can say that, but, you know, is now an individual who has these issues that are the same issues that anybody else would personally have.
Well done. I think that's a great way to end it. Ali, do you have any final thoughts that you want to share with us?
You covered jobs, Mission Impossible, marriage, or marriage or divorce.
Okay, Ali, let me ask you this. This is a genuine question. I think this wasn't kind of like in the text that we discussed, but I actually remember wanting to ask you this before. So you work with an organization, Who is a Saint, and Who is a Saint basically, you know, is an organization that tries to help impoverished people in the name of the Prophet's grandson, Imam Hussein. Now, I remember you did a great achievement. I think it was last year, where you got Who is a Saint billboards in Times Square, right? And I remember there was a community backlash. Well done. Let's have a round of applause for that. Well done. I remember you and your team. And I remember there was a community backlash because people were like, this can't be real. It's fake, you know? And it's like, we have almost been, with this specific example, we've been almost made to believe that it's impossible for us to get, for example, a banner about Imam Hussein in Times Square, right? Yeah. So similarly on that same topic, do you believe that as Muslim communities, and again, like we started this whole episode speaking about how we never believed we could be in Hollywood, but do you still feel like that there's a sense of, you know, Muslims not believing that they belong in these environments? They don't belong in a Mission Impossible. They don't belong in an action film. They don't belong on TV because they're not represented there. Do you feel like there's a sense of that exists? And if so, how can we overcome that?
I think it does exist. And then when you do find someone that's Muslim and has been in a movie or film, it becomes a big deal, even though if they had a small role, because they're right. So I think it's going to get overcome with time. With more people that are open-minded and go into these fields. As you know, you've been doing poetry for some time, and more people are starting to do some more poetry. So spoken word poetry, Islamic poetry. So things like that, I think it's going to start progressing into more of, you know, film and different types of arts that people are going to get into that. It's just going to take some time. And you have to keep in mind, in London, you guys have been there for a while. Like the Muslim community has been there for a while. In America, we're just getting on to second or third generation. So it's going to take us a little bit longer. We're a pretty young Muslim community in America, in my opinion. And maybe another 10 or 20 years, we'll start seeing more.
Sounds good. Hasnain, any final thoughts of wisdom to close off this episode?
There's a few things that we didn't mention that I just want to highlight.
Yeah.
Along with Ali's comment, I think in the UK alone, there's a lot more funding for the arts, whereas in the US, there's not much.
That is actually very interesting because, yeah, you're right. We do have access to funding from the British Film Institute. Yeah. In America, how does it work? Is there access to funding?
So from my perspective, you can crowdfund on your own, use your own money, which is kind of what I do to produce my own production. Hence why I have my finance job.
That's why your internet keeps cutting out, because you keep spending your money on films.
That's true. That's true. That's true. And endowments and stuff like that. So you have to apply for an endowment, like the Ford Foundation. Ask them, like, hey, I'm doing this film. I'll promote you. Give me $10,000. And it goes through this whole process, and it sucks. It's tough. It's difficult, right? Because there's no big government sponsorship. Like, hey, we'll help you out. I mean, New York is kind of doing that a little bit. But then again, everybody flocks to LA or New York to do a film. So if you have the masses flocking here to do films, and you're going up against other non-Muslims who are also grabbing the same money, it's difficult. So I wanted to mention that. There's
like a million Starbucks baristas who are writing screenplays and trying to get auditions.
Basically, exactly. And then the last thing, not the last thing, because I want to close it off on something else. The second to last thing I think we didn't mention is back to the first conversation we have growing up with Hollywood. We didn't even mention Bollywood and how that was something. Ali, why are you laughing, bro?
He's laughing because he's like, I've been here for an hour. He's not feeling well. He's waiting to go to sleep.
I feel like I'm listening to a sheikh at a mosque. Before I end, I have one more thing to say.
Listen, so second to last thing is the influence of Bollywood, because you have to understand politically, Bollywood and Bollywood has been there for a while. I grew up on watching Bollywood films. I don't watch them anymore because I don't really connect with that anymore. And you also have to understand how they implement Muslims in their film too. And it's not usually in the positive light either. So when you have the two biggest industries showcasing Muslims not in the most positive light, that's a big problem, right? I just wanted to highlight that. And to end it off, please support us. Please support my show. Please support this podcast, and look out for our future episodes, because they're going to be great.
No, inshallah, there definitely will be. I think we do have a lot of interesting topics coming up. So we have, for example, one of them is talking about the $1 billion sneaker industry, which hopefully should be fun. We also have episodes coming out speaking about different forms of expression and art, and just exploring like our relationship with these films. I think this podcast is a bit deeper than just bringing out some films and talking about how much we like them. It's about our relationship with them as Muslims as people who are living in diaspora. We belong technically in many ways in the East, but we're here in the West, and we're kind of interacting with this industry and this culture that didn't grow up, that wasn't born out of spirituality in Islam. So a lot of the stories that we watch, they're told by people who don't believe in Allah or Prophet Muhammad or Quran, and as a result, we kind of interpret that and bring that energy into us as Muslims, and interpret it into our own ways. So that's what I really want to do with this podcast, just explore all these kind of different elements of culture and popular culture and how they kind of interact with our, with our culture. Ali has almost lost it. Ali, you said you were sick, right? Do you want to share with the audience that you were not feeling well, so they can understand
what's going on?
Why?
I hope it's not Corona. I really hope it's not Corona.
No, it's not Corona. It's a headache, right?
A headache, my eyes hurting.
It's old age, man.
Getting really salty.
Inshallah, get some sleep, get some rest, have a bath, have a peppermint tea, and inshallah you'll be back next time, inshallah. All right, guys, it's been fun. We'll see you guys again soon. Assalamu alaikum.
Like